Now, prior to starting this company, and for the first 7 years, I did quite a bit of writing. I wrote a couple of books and 100 or so articles that were published in various magazines. But for the last 7 years, I have published almost nothing, for the good and simple reason that I didn't really feel that I had anything new to say. And you do, after a while, get a little tired of repeating something that you've been saying for a number of years. However, within the last few months, we have solved some problems that 8 months ago I personally considered to be impossible. And now I do have something to say, so I will be writing again. Now, I don't know, of course, who all of you people are, and I can't even see you very well from here. Some of you are reasonably familiar with the history of Nautilus, and some of you perhaps are not familiar at all. But basically, what Nautilus has done is to recognize some problems that existed in exercise, to approach those problems in an attempt to understand them, and then, having learned to understand the problems, to approach them from the direction of attempting to solve those problems. Now, I was clearly aware, as far back as 1939, of the need for variation in resistance during exercise. I didn't understand it. I hadn't even defined it, but I was trying to do something about it. My first attempt in that direction was to add chains to a barbell in such a manner that as you lifted the barbell, the chains were steadily lifted off the floor and added their weight to the weight of the barbell. Well, that doesn't work all that well, I can tell you from experience. It makes a lot of noise, it's dirty, it messes up the floor, and it's not very efficient. My next step was to attempt to make pulley devices. I made a base weight with horns on it in such a fashion that I could attach chains to the horns. And in this fashion, I could increase the weight at any rate I wanted to by using different lengths of chain and different sizes of chain. I could increase the weight slowly or rapidly, a great deal or a small amount. But having increased it, I couldn't decrease it. I had to stay with the maximum level that I reached. So that had some applications, and that was an improvement, but it was no great improvement. Because in most exercises, your strength doesn't just go up. It may go down and then go up, or it may go up and then go back down. Well, over the years, I tried a lot of things. In 1958, I built a machine without really understanding it. Having finished it, I had had what I considered to be a better idea. So I put the machine out in my backyard, and it stood there and rusted into a pile of junk and was never used. I had solved most, not all, but most of the problems of providing full-range exercise without even being aware of all the problems, and certainly without being aware that I had solved them. But by the time I built this machine, I had had what I considered a better idea, so I went off then on a tangent on another approach. And there the solution sat in my backyard, rusting into a pile of junk. It was never used. Later, when the evidence would point back to where I had been, my tendency was to say, oh no, that's wrong. I tried that and it doesn't work. Well, I hadn't tried it. I built it, but I hadn't tried it. 10 years later, in 1968, I was living in Africa. I had built an exercise machine, maybe the 200th one at that point, I don't really know how many. In an attempt to solve these problems, was using it. And in the middle of the night, about 2:15, I suddenly had an idea. So I called one of my associates at that time in the morning. On the phone, I took a pencil and a piece of paper. I had him get a pencil and a piece of paper. I told him to take his pencil and go to the upper left-hand corner of the sheet. Now go to the right so far, now come down. And I had him draw that piece, that part, over the phone. I drew it. Took me about 30 minutes to describe it to him. I said, now build it and have it here at 8 o'clock in the morning. And he did. And we put it on the machine, and it didn't work. Didn't work at all. It failed. But it failed in such a dramatic manner that for the first time I understood why it failed. And I also understood what it took to make it not fail. So for the first time, I really understood what was required. I left Africa shortly after that and came back to this country without having a chance to redesign the entire machine, because it wasn't merely a matter of adding a part to my existing machine. I had to redesign it, but I then knew what to do, basically. So I got back in this country and almost immediately started building a new machine, or machines, plural, because we built many of them. Step by step, once I realized, really, for the first time, I really understood the problems so I could approach them logically. And we did. The use of a cam to vary the resistance in exercise was actually suggested by my son, Gary. There are any number of ways you can vary the resistance in an exercise. Cam is not the only way, although it's by far the best way and really the only practical way. But I had not thought of the cam. I was discussing a number of other ways and making sketches, and I drew a gearbox as viewed from the side. But I didn't tell my son it was a gearbox. And I said, this would do it, but it would be extremely expensive. And he said, oh, no, that'd be very cheap. And I said, yeah, about $20,000 a machine, maybe, just for the gearbox. Oh, no, we could build them for a few dollars. Well, he's talking about a cam, but I was thinking about a gearbox. Eventually, he told me. And as soon as he said it, of course, I realized he was right. So I sat up that night designing the first cam. Having designed it, the range of movement required, the shape required, having drawn it, I was immediately struck by the fact that it had a strong resemblance to the cross-section of a Nautilus shell. And it does. So the name was more or less unavoidable. In any case, the next morning as he came down to go to school, my younger son Edgar saw the drawing on the board, and since my older son has a navel that looks like he was twisted off the vine, a spiral navel, he looked at the first cam on the drawing board and he says, where'd you get the idea of that, from Gary's belly button? I couldn't very well call it Gary's Belly Button Sports Medical Industries or my son's Naval Sports Medical Industries, thus the name Nautilus. That cam makes it possible to precisely, accurately, instantly, automatically vary the resistance in any single axis movement. Now, what is a single axis movement? A movement where rotation occurs around only one axis or joint of the body. A curl, you're rotating around the axis of your elbow. A triceps extension, again, rotating around the axis of the elbow, but now in an opposite direction. A leg extension, a leg curl, a pullover movement, any movement where rotation occurs around only one axis. A compound movement, in contrast, is a much more complex sort of a thing. A bench press is a compound movement. A leg press, a seated press, chinning yourself, parallel dips, a squat. All of those are compound movements. In most of them, the direction of movement, the line of movement, is more or less in a straight line. When you bench press, you don't move the weight precisely in a straight line. If you did, it would fall over and break your knees. It must move slightly upwards in order to remain on the center of gravity. But basically, the line is pretty straight. However, that straight line resultant of movement is produced by 3 rotational movements. In order to push a barbell in a straight line, you've got to rotate around your shoulder axis, around your elbow axis, and around your wrist axis. So that straight line movement is really a resultant of a triple rotational movement. The strength curves in a single axis movement are relatively simple. While there is an increase in some positions in strength and a decrease in other positions, there are no really gross differences. You do not have a situation where you're 3 times as strong in one position as you are in another, for example. In most cases, the change in strength is something on the order of 40 or 50%, which is very significant and very important. But by comparison to an exercise such as the squat, there's almost a flat strength curve. In an exercise such as a squat, if you squat all the way down, which very few people do, when you start out of the extremely low position, you're relatively strong. But as you move upwards, you rapidly become weaker until you reach the so-called sticking point, where the weight feels very heavy. Now, if you manage to get by that sticking point, then you start getting very strong again. And insofar as your muscles are concerned, as you reach the lockout, as you become fully erect, your muscles are infinitely strong. You could support the universe if your bones could stand the load, because the moment arm of the resistance is 0. Your body rotates, therefore it involves torque. Torque is a resultant of 2 factors, moment or moment arm, or lever arm. We'll call it lever. Torque is a resultant of lever and perpendicular force. Now, if the lever is 0, then it makes no difference what the force is, because 0 times an infinite force is still 0. If your bones could stand the load, you could stand up underneath the universe and support it. The fact is, you could actually move it a very short distance. If you would break the lock of your knees and lower it just a tiny fraction of an inch, you could then go back up. You're that strong, or your muscles are, but not your bones. A positive cam, the cams we've been using for years in all of our machines, simply cannot vary the resistance rapidly enough or to a great enough degree to accommodate properly the actual requirements for variation in resistance that are really called for, that are really needed in an exercise such as the squat. And make no mistake about it, the squat is the single most important exercise ever discovered by man, and one of the most dangerous. The mafia have a saying, if you can't lose, you can't win. The Chinese understand the situation very well. They have only one symbol, one pictograph, which means opportunity, but it also means danger. The squat provides you with opportunities that are unprecedented by any other exercise you can think of. But it's dangerous as hell. So you have to ask yourself, is the opportunity worth the danger? Done properly, which it seldom is, a barbell squat need not be all that dangerous. But of course, very few people do them properly, so they become dangerous. Done properly, a barbell squat is capable of producing degrees of muscle mass increase that cannot be produced by any other exercise or any other combination of exercises. The squat as an exercise is almost a miracle, and it's dangerous as hell. We worked on that problem for years. I thought about it for 30 years. Did not believe it could be solved. 12 years ago, I started thinking and working on the problems with the squat very seriously, and I've been working on them ever since. We built the first squat machine that had any degree of practical application in 1973. We built another one in 1974, or later in 73. We used the first one in Colorado State and the university out there in an experiment in 73. We used the other one at West Point in an experiment in 1975. After the experiment, the cadets begged me to sell them the machine. The staff of West Point begged me to sell them the machine, and I refused. It was dangerous. And it wasn't a hell of a lot better than a barbell squat. Somewhat better, but not much. At that point in time, I didn't know how to build a squat machine, and neither did anybody else, although some of our competitors have been selling for years what they call a squat machine. We built them by the dozens, over the years perhaps by the hundreds. I made sketches literally by the tens of thousands and discussed the problems and thought about them and analyzed them for many thousands of hours. And 8 months ago, if you'd have asked me, I would have told you that it was impossible to vary the resistance properly in a compound exercise. Not difficult, impossible. But had I told you that, I would have been wrong. Because 8 months ago, I did not understand the implications, the potential, the possibilities of the negative cam. And now I do. The first practical application of the negative cam is in the Nautilus squat machine. The negative cam can vary the resistance properly. The negative cam can do damn near anything. You want to destroy the universe? You want to make an H-bomb look like a firecracker? Give me strong enough materials and I'll do either one. A negative cam is capable of producing an infinite force, or so close as not to matter. A hell of a lot closer than you want to go. The only limitation on the force potential of a negative cam is the structural integrity of the materials. I can take a weight stack of 100 pounds and easily produce a force of 1,000,000 pounds. Not enough? You want 10 million? 100 million? Billion? Do you really think your skeleton's that strong? I'll build it if you'll strap it on. It'll be interesting. You'll be the world's shortest man, I guarantee you. And quick. With a negative cam, it is possible to vary the resistance properly. We can start out in the low position with the weight very high, as it should be. And as you start to move, we can instantly, automatically reduce that resistance grossly, as we must, because you're getting weaker. When you hit the sticking point, you will be at your weakest point, and we can have the resistance exactly right for you in that position. Then, as you pass that point, we can increase the resistance as fast as you need it, or rather, as fast as you can stand it. Because as you lock out, your muscles are infinitely strong, but your bones aren't. So I could give you a force of 100 million pounds in the lockout, and your muscles could handle it, but not your bones. So in point of fact, we've given you a force of 1,174 pounds, which is the equivalent of an average size 200-pound man doing a full squat with a barbell with 1,000 pounds. So I rather suspect that the resistance there is adequate for anybody if their name isn't Paul Anderson. And in case your name is Paul Anderson, we've taken care of that too, because we've added a little thing called an akinetic device. How much force you want? 5,000 pounds in the first repetition? We'll give it to you. 10,000? 20,000? Hope your bones are strong. This machine can literally give you any amount of resistance with no sacrifice, without sacrificing negative work, without sacrificing the automatically variable resistance, without sacrificing stretching or pre-stretching or any of the other requirements. What about the dangers? For all practical purposes, there are no dangers. We've eliminated them all. Get stuck in the bottom? Impossible. If you get your right knee back behind your right ear and can't move, just bend your left leg and the weight is instantly removed from both legs. How do you get under a squat? You know, in such a position that you have your knees behind your ears, where you're wedged in there like a large sardine in a small can with no oil. How do you get into it? When you get through, how do you get out? Well, you get into it in the mid-range of possible movement with no force. Then you push out with both legs, thereby raising the weight, and then one leg stays out, locked out. Then you can do a full squat. A full squat? Yes. As full as you can with a barbell? No, considerably fuller. Because with a barbell, you have to stop when your buttocks reach the floor. With this machine, you can cut a hole in the floor to stick your buttocks through and keep going. Or you can stand on a cliff, you know, on the edge of a cliff backwards. Don't lose your balance. Ah, you say, but Dr. Fred Allman and a PhD named Klein out in Atlanta wrote an article 15 or 20 years ago about a subject that neither one of them understood, an article that has become famous or infamous, an article which was unprecedentedly quoted by millions of people who never read it, misquoted, an article that's probably received more attention and more lies than any other article ever published in the history of exercise. And what was the article concerned with? A violent attack against the squat by people who didn't even understand it, although there was some basis for their statements. Why was this article so widely circulated? Because it afforded millions of lazy people with an excuse not to do an exercise that they weren't doing in the first place, that they were too damn lazy to do. Oh, yes, I'd like to do squats. You know, they're great exercise, but, you know, they've proven that squats damage your knees, and that's the reason I don't do them. Yeah, right, sure. Yeah. People do squats. Millions of people don't do squats because they've been falsely led to believe that a result can occur, and it can, Try bench pressing and then letting go of the weight when you got it directly over your neck and see what happens. That's happened a time or two, you know. And it killed people fatally and permanently. They didn't like it. But that doesn't mean the bench press is not that good an exercise or that dangerous. You have to have some common sense. And if you put a 500-pound barbell on your back and bend your legs and relax, you're going to hit the bottom so damn fast and so hard that you're going to instantly lose any interest in exercise. Or anything else, for that matter. So, you know, you can be stupid, and most people are in some ways. I've been kind of stupid myself. I was stupid enough years ago to listen to some of the then existing experts in the field of exercise. I was even dumb enough to do some of the things they recommended. But I'll guarantee you, I liked it a hell of a lot better when I could straighten my arms before I yanked the triceps tendons out by the roots and rolled them up the back of my arm like a window shade. And I'll guarantee you I liked it a lot better when I had 7 bones in my neck instead of only 4, so that I could look behind me without having to turn my whole body. And I liked it a lot better when I could get out of a chair in 1 movement instead of 3 and straighten my back. And I liked it a lot better when my right shoulder was the same distance from the floor as my left shoulder. And I don't really see the advantage of having my knees click like castanets when I walk up and down stairs, all of which are results not of a poor tool, the barbell, but of the stupid criminal misuse of a good tool by me, for me being dumb enough to listen to people who were even dumber than I was, or maybe not, you know. Maybe they did it on purpose, how do I know? The barbell, by comparison to any previously existing tool, is almost a miracle. The barbell, in a sense, was its own worst enemy for many years, because when the barbell came onto the scene, it then, for the first time, became possible to produce increases in strength and muscular size that were literally impossible before the barbell. And a few people did. Damn few, but some. And they produced such a degree, such an unprecedented degree of muscular size that it scared the hell out of the general public, because nobody had ever seen anybody that looked like that before. How would a literate man appear to an illiterate society? A freak. And the first people who used barbells looked like freaks to the general public because they'd never seen anybody like that before. So it took a long time for this to be accepted. I have never attacked the barbell. I'm not doing it now. I've used barbells for over 40 years. They're damn near a miracle, but they're not perfect. Properly used, they're perfectly safe. Improperly used, they are extremely dangerous. Improperly used, a Nautilus machine is dangerous. Improperly used, any tool is dangerous. A Nautilus machine is nothing more nor less than an improved barbell, a logical barbell, a rational barbell, a sane barbell. Yet you got all these experts out here telling you, oh, you got to use free weights for power, and you got to use Nautilus for this, and you got to use a sandbag for that. Train this way for definition, train that way for power, train some other way for speed, train some other way for size. BS, crap, nonsense. If you are training in such a fashion that you are producing results, you will increase all of those factors, and damn near on a 1-to-1 ratio. Your muscular anaerobic endurance goes up and down in direct proportion to your increases in strength. Your static strength and your dynamic strength go up and down in direct proportion to one another, and anybody who believes otherwise is too dumb to talk to. And yet, many of the experts in the field of exercise physiology would believe that they can increase your dynamic strength without increasing your static strength. And that is such a stupid statement, I can hardly believe it. Don't take my word for it, let's prove it. This young man comes into the gym and he's never touched a weight in his life. And I put him in a bench press machine to test his strength. Why a machine? Because I'm testing his strength, not his skill. Either he can raise it or he can't. Either he can lift it or he can't. He doesn't have to balance it. He doesn't have to have the technique. He doesn't have to hit the groove. I don't care about his skill. I want to test his strength. And we find that he can lift 100 pounds once in the bench press, but just barely. He gets it up there, but that's all he can do. Now we rest him 10 minutes and we give him 105 pounds, and he cannot move it. Too heavy. So we rest him 10 minutes, and now I lift the weight for him into this position, the mid-range position. And I hand it to him, and I say, now hold it in that position if you can. And he tries, and he succeeds. He could not lift it to that position. He cannot raise it any higher, but he can hold it motionless. How much force is he producing? 105 pounds. How do we know? Because if he was producing an ounce more than 105 pounds, the bar would go up. And if he was producing an ounce less than 105 pounds, it would come down. So it's not more than 105, and it's not less than 105. And there's only one damn number that's neither more nor less than 105, and that's 105. So his static strength is 105 pounds, obviously. So his dynamic strength is 100. His static strength is 105. We rest him 10 minutes, we give him 110, and he cannot hold it. It goes back down. That exceeded his static strength. 6 months later, he's been training regularly. I've been observing him. I assume that he's doubled his strength. Take him into the gym, I put him back in the same machine, and I give him 200 pounds, and he pushes it up. Not very fast, but it goes up. He is twice as strong dynamically as he was 6 months earlier. 6 months earlier, he could do it with 100. Now he can do it with 200. Are you now really dumb enough to believe that if I then gave him 110 pounds in the mid-range, that it would come crashing down onto his chest? That's what the isokinetic people would have you believe. They would have you believe that they can double your dynamic strength while not doing a damn thing for your static strength. That man had to produce over 200 pounds to raise that 200. He had to produce over 200 pounds of force to get it started. And once it was started, he had to produce exactly 200 to keep it going. So his muscles, that's all muscles do, is produce force. Whether movement occurs or doesn't occur depends upon the resistance opposing that force. If the resistance is lighter than the force, it'll move. If the resistance is equal to the force, it won't move. If the resistance exceeds the force, then it'll move down. That's just common sense. And yet, they would have you believe that having doubled his dynamic strength, that nothing has happened to his static strength. That is stupid almost beyond belief. Now, why would an MD or a PhD or a PDQ or whatever they might be believe something that dumb? Because they put him in a Cybex machine and they train him, and not a damn thing happens except he accommodates to the pain. After a while, he realizes it's probably not going to kill him, and he starts working a little harder, and he doesn't get any stronger. He doesn't get anything except a higher reading in the dynamic movement. But now, later, you test him statically in the various positions, and he's not a damn bit stronger, which means he's no stronger dynamically either, because dynamic and static strength are one-on-one, and anybody who believes otherwise is too stupid for me to discuss it with them, which means there are several thousand of them out there that I won't talk to. Too strong? No, not strong enough. Some of the claims made by isokinetics people are frightening. Unfortunately, some of these people are training athletes, if you can call it training. One of these experts got up on a podium in front of several hundred PhDs and MDs and other interested people and talked about the dangers of jogging. Pointed out that jogging involves as much as 2 or 3 G-forces. That is to say, if you weigh 200 pounds, you may impose a force of 600 pounds on your foot when you jog, all of which is perfectly true. And he then told the audience that this was very dangerous. However, by a fortuitous circumstance, having pointed out this problem to him, he was now going to solve it for him, because he had his order blanks with him, and he was prepared to sell you a tram, miniature trampoline, and he would take orders right after the talk. Thank you, right over here. He also falsely claimed to have invented this device, which he didn't, but that's not unusual for him. He invented the wheel, fire, the bow and arrow. So having pointed out that 3 Gs are dangerous, he's now going to solve this for you. 20 minutes later, in the same lecture on the same day to the same audience, he recommended jump squats as a safe, productive method of training. Jump squats? Yes. Jumping off a 30-inch bench onto a concrete floor with a 200-pound barbell on your back. Now that's safe. After all, that's only 100 Gs, you know, and jogging's dangerous. Why, that's 3. I used to think 100 was more than 3, but yeah, this guy's a PhD, you know, he's bound to know. Well, let me tell you something. Jump squats will certainly produce results, quick results. You won't believe how quick they are. Broken bones, torn muscles, tendons yanked out by the roots, destroyed backs. Anybody here like to see what a jump squat will do? We probably got a barbell around here, and this is about 30 inches. I'll be glad to demonstrate that, let one of you demonstrate it. Yet those are the kind of people that are training thousands of athletes in this country. What would be the response if you were a swimming coach and you had a team of swimmers and the head of the school came out and found you with these swimmers out on the football field, blocking and tackling with these swimmers? Do you think you'd keep your job? What the hell has blocking and tackling got to do with swimming or basketball or archery? Has a great deal to do with football. You've got to develop the skill at blocking and tackling, and there's only one way to do it, and that's by blocking and tackling, even though doing so is dangerous. That is an unavoidable danger in football. If you're going to play football, you're going to meet those dangers. If you're not prepared to meet them, then don't play. But it would be criminal insanity to have basketball players or swimmers practicing blocking and tackling. There's no benefit. That's not a skill of any value to them. So you're exposing them to a danger with no possibility of return. Yet we have a very similar situation. We have tens of thousands of football players and others being taught competitive weightlifting moves, power cleans, cleans and jerks, snatches, which are utterly unproductive, totally unproductive for the purpose of building strength, and dangerous as hell. All those lifts do is teach you the skill required to lift a barbell in that particular fashion, a skill that is necessary to a competitive weightlifter, a skill that can be acquired in only one way, and that's by practicing the lift, even though the lift is dangerous. Those dangers are unavoidable for a competitive weightlifter, but it's criminal malpractice to recommend such lifts to anybody except a competitive weightlifter. And yet, thousands of coaches are doing just that. And as a consequence, we have 63,000 knee operations in this country every year as a result of football, most of which injuries occur on the field, but a large part of which injuries were produced in the gym. Exercise, proper exercise, will never hurt you. It will hurt your muscles. It'll make them hurt. If it doesn't, you're not doing it right. But it won't injure you. If you are training in such a fashion that your muscles don't hurt during the exercise, then don't bother. Quit. Do something else. So exercise will hurt, but it won't hurt you. In fact, it'll go a long way to prevent injury, or it should, but in practice, it frequently causes injuries. Again, I'm not against a barbell. A Nautilus machine is nothing but a barbell. But I am much against the criminal malpractice, the insanity that is being preached around this country, particularly for the training of athletes. The guy that started that whole thing, fortunately, is now dead. His name is Alvin Roy, was. He was from Louisiana. He was in New Orleans when I lived 35 miles away in Slidell. I didn't know him, but I could read the papers. And when he opened a health club there and sold everybody in town a lifetime membership and then closed it over the weekend and left town, I read about it in the papers. 2 years later, he did the same damn thing and in the same location. He didn't even have the courtesy to go across the street. And I read about that at the time. Later, he hitched his star to Billy Cannon, a famous Louisiana football player who was also a weightlifter. And Alvin hitched his star to Billy Cannon's, and I don't know that he ever met Billy Cannon, but he damn sure wasn't responsible for his training. But Billy Cannon couldn't spend his life following Alvin around, pointing out that Alvin was lying every time he made that claim. Alvin would get up on the podium in front of a bunch of coaches and foam at the mouth and storm and run up and down and talk about clutching power and dynamic power and explosive power. Gee, coaches, you want your people to be explosive. They got to train explosive. And coaches, of course, being coaches, they believed it. After all, they don't know anything about weight training. This guy's a world-famous expert. Why, didn't he produce Billy Cannon? No, he didn't, but he claimed to. How are they going to check? He was a con man, a BS artist, a liar, a phony. He was worse than that. At first, when I first met him, I thought he was dumb enough to believe this. You know, I knew he was wrong, I knew he was stupid, but I thought he was dumb enough to believe it, so at least he was sincere. But eventually I went down and visited a training camp down here, the Saints in Vero Beach. It was worse than that. He didn't believe it. He knew better. He damn sure didn't practice it. He'd take one of these football players and lead him over to a machine and sit him down, and the guy could have used 200 pounds. He'd give him 40 pounds. And he'd say, well, now do a few movements there, John, you know. And now that's good, and he'd pat him on the ass and take him over here and give him 50 pounds where he could have used 300. Explosive training hell. That was the last thing in the world he was going to do. Himself, personally, because he knew what the results would be. But he also knew that that's what the coaches want to hear. And he was perfectly willing to tell them something that he knew was dangerous, because he knew that if he did, why, they'd believe him. Well, I'm not going to stand up here and tell you what you want to hear necessarily. If it's wrong, it's wrong. And any of you here that practice explosive lifts ought to have your marbles unscrambled, because you'll goddamn sure end up with your joints scrambled, I guarantee you. I've been there. Show me a man who has regularly performed competitive type lifts, and I'll show you permanent damage to his skeleton with an X-ray. 100%. Now, he may not be as old as I am, and he may not be aware of all this damage yet. Give him a few years and he will, but I'll show it to you now on an X-ray. 100%. And at 25 or 30, you may think you're Superman. Wait 30 or 40 years and see. You'll like it better if you can straighten your arms, if you can straighten your back. You'll like it better if you can turn your head. I guarantee you. Exercise is capable of producing potential benefits almost beyond your wildest imagination. And it's also, improperly done, dangerous as hell. Properly done, it is not dangerous at all. It will go a long ways to preventing injuries. Back to the squat machine. Our first application, it may well be our last application of the negative cam, we don't know, is the dual squat machine. It solves all of the problems of the squat, it improves the exercise, and it goes one step further. When Fred Allman wrote his article criticizing the squat, he was talking about the fact that your calf muscle becomes a fulcrum over which your leg is bent by the force, the resultant being that the knee is pulled apart. The result being that in that position your knee cannot rotate, is not even trying to rotate, is being stretched apart. And he was right. The same thing can happen in a leg extension machine if you go too far back, which is why in the Nautilus leg extension machine we limit the range of movement. I don't know if the microphone can pick me up over here, but I'm going to try to show you what I'm talking about here. If I put my leg out there, the knee axis is here. But if I bend that leg, when it comes back here and that calf muscle hits the back of my thigh, that axis is no longer there. That axis is here. It has moved 6 inches. That knee can no longer rotate. It is being pulled apart. The same thing happens in a squat. In the leg extension, with the leg bent fully, the force is that way, so the force is in the worst possible direction for this purpose. Fortunately, the force is not all that high. So you've got a bad direction and a medium force, enough to destroy your knee. In a squat, in the low position, the force is not quite, the direction of the force is not quite that bad. The force is this way, but the force is a hell of a lot higher. The result is the same thing. If you go too far back in a leg extension with a heavy weight, you'll destroy your knee. You go too low in a squat machine, in a squat with a barbell with a heavy weight, you'll destroy your knees. But you can get in that dual squat machine and put your ears, put your knees behind your ears, and you won't hurt your knees. Why? Because the force is not perpendicular to the bones in your leg. The force is not slanting towards the bone. The force is in line with your bone. This young man will come up here a minute. I'll demonstrate something. If I take his arm and bend it, it rotates around the axis of the elbow with no problem. What if I put this in there? And now I push that way. I'm doing two things. I'm trying to bend the bone of his arm. The arm is no longer rotating down here at the elbow. It's trying to rotate up here. So I'm pulling this apart, stretching the tendons. Okay? But what if instead, what if I push in that direction? Now Now what am I doing to the elbow? Not a damn thing. And that's the movement we have in the Nautilus Dual squat machine. So you can do a low movement. How low you want to go? Some people aren't flexible enough to get into that position. Some people have got massive legs and can't get into that position. Or their torso to leg length ratios are such that they cannot get into that position. But if you're built in such a manner, and if you're flexible enough, you could stick your ass a foot underneath the floor if you cut a hole out. You can literally go that low, and you won't hurt your knees. We wouldn't sell a squat machine last year or the year before or 12 years before that because we didn't know how to build one, but we know how to build one now. And that squat machine is the single most productive piece of exercise equipment in the history of the world, and that's a gross understatement. I'm going to be very interested to see what some of the specimens are going to look like that have used that machine for a year or two. What other, if any other applications for the negative cam we will come up with, I don't know. We're working on it. That remains to be seen in the future. As I said, 8 months ago, I thought this was an impossible problem. That's why we never sold a squat machine. That didn't stop Universal from selling them. That didn't stop Digger up in Canada from selling them, or at least calling them a squat machine, which they are not. But we're not running a con game here. And we don't know how to build one. We're not going to sell it. I've covered just about everything I think I wanted to say here. Got another 5 minutes. Anybody in the audience have any questions on any subject? If I don't know the answer. Then they left the military academy after the post-test in a state of stunned shock. Took the information back to Ken Cooper, and he utterly refused to even look at it. He didn't believe his own people. Now, in what way did we influence these people? Not at all. We stayed away from them. We didn't associate with them. Their dealings were strictly with the military academy personnel. We avoided them like the plague because we did not later want to be accused of having in any fashion influenced these people's decision. But we demonstrated 7.5 years ago at West Point the ability to produce an improvement in cardiovascular ability in a period of 6 weeks that is impossible to produce in 6 months in any other fashion. Now, some of you may think that's an overstatement. It isn't. It's an understatement. I could have said 6 years, and it would have been equally true. 60 years? 600 years? Doesn't matter. Starting with people who are already in what they consider to be good cardiovascular condition. With proper training, you can improve their cardiovascular condition in 6 weeks to a degree, to a level that is impossible to attain in any other fashion with any amount of training. Not difficult, impossible. Now, what is cardiovascular condition? Well, we don't really know, but we can test some of the effects. We took a group of cadets, military cadets, who are not random people by the very fact that they're in the military academy. They're very select people. Secondly, these people were football players, which means they were doubly selected physical specimens. We trained them for 2 weeks in order to get them in good enough condition that we could test them without killing them. Now, these people had been in a wide variety of physical activities for years. Every one of them had been on a strength program for several years. They were all involved in running and wrestling and fist fighting in a wide variety of activities. So they were outstanding physical specimens to start with. Yet the level of training we were going to give them was such that they literally could not tolerate it without 2 weeks of careful break-in training. After 2 weeks, then we tested them.
And then a little less than 6 weeks later, we tested them again. And Cooper's people tested them, and the Academy tested them, and other outside experts tested them. The first test for cardiovascular purposes was to run them through a workout non-stop. We laid out the machines in an L shape, down one wall, around the corner, and down another wall. And then we wired them up with a transmitter on their chest, transmitting a signal from their heart to an EKG, which we had modified for this purpose. We modified the EKG so that we had a needle pointing to a dial, somewhat like an automobile speedometer. We needed that in order not to kill these people. That wasn't the purpose. The idea was to test them, not to kill them. So when their heart rate would approach 230, at which point normal individuals go into fibrillation, the heart is no longer a pump, it becomes a vibrating machine, and you die. So when their heart would get over 225, we'd back off a little. When it got down to about 210, we'd lean on them again. And we kept these people at that level for 40 minutes. Within a few seconds of getting into the program, less than a minute, they were way over 200, and they stayed that way for 40 minutes. We filmed all of this with multiple synchronous cameras so that at no time were they ever not on camera from several different angles. We ran a camera on the face of the EKG, on the speedometer, so we could tell at any given moment by looking at one film, putting him into sync, what is he doing? What effect is that having on his heartbeat? We shot literally hundreds of thousands of feet of color film during that experiment. 6 weeks later, we put them through the same program, except by that point, they had improved so much that they were able to perform 60% more work in only 75% of the time. Now let's look in very simple terms at the cardiovascular load. During their first workout, they performed, we'll say arbitrarily, 100 units of work. Whatever they did, call it 100 units, 100%. And how long did it take them to do it? 40 minutes. So we divide the 40 minutes of time into the 100 units of work, which means that their average pace of work was 2.5 units of work per minute. And what did that do to them? It damn near killed them. At the end of the program, they were all literally in a state of shock. They couldn't stand up. Some of them didn't know their names. We were practically dragging them from one machine to the next. 6 weeks later, the same people went through the same program, except now it didn't take them 40 minutes. It only took them 30 minutes. Using 60% more weight, doing the same number of repetitions at the same speed of movement. So now, instead of dividing 40 minutes into 100 units of work for an average pace of work of 2.5 units per minute, now we've got more work. We've got 160 units of work and only 30 units of time. So divide the 30 into the 160, and they were then doing 5.3 units of work per minute. They had more than double the metabolic load per minute. And what effect did that have on their pulse? One of them hit 192 briefly. The other members never cracked 190. They stayed in the high 150s to low 160s to the high 180s. In other words, previously their pulse rate was running from 210 to 230. Now doing more than twice the work per minute, and then only one subject cracked 190. He went to 192. We were trying to get him up over 200. We couldn't. They had increased that much in 6 weeks, actually less than 6 weeks. Now, a wide variety of other tests were given to them. One of the things they did was the 2-mile run in minimum time. Throttle to the floor, absolute, all out for 2 miles, and measure their elapsed time. In this same 6 weeks period, they reduced their time in the 2-mile run by an average of 88 seconds. Now, mind you, they were already trained athletes to start with. A control group of other football players that were trained simultaneously in a conventional manner, and both groups taking, in addition to the other programs, both groups involved in spring football practice, the other group improved 20 seconds. So we improved our people 88 seconds against 20 seconds improvement that the other group had. Every single test that was conducted on these people gave similar results. They were 60% stronger, 6-0. That's an increase of 10% per week in strength. Their metabolic or cardiovascular ability was more than doubled. And by the way, after that first test, where they did 100 units in 40 minutes and were in shock afterwards, some of them laid on the floor of the gym for 2 hours afterwards. The subsequent test 6 weeks later, one of the guys finished the end of the test, ripped the transmitter off his chest, and ran out of the gym at a dead run, down the hall, down the steps, into another gym, and got into a boxing ring less than 5 minutes later and beat the hell out of another guy immediately after the test. So he wasn't exactly in shock. Now, that's the kind of results you can get. But that's not the kind of results you are going to get if you go through some of these namby-pamby circuit training routines that people call cardiovascular testing of the ability of strength training. You are wasting your time with those. I'm not telling you it's an easy way to train. I don't know any easy ways to train that are worth doing. I know some effective ways. I know some fast ways. I know some very productive ways, but there isn't a damn thing easy about any of them. So if you're looking for an easy way to do something, you've come to the wrong place, because this ain't it. 40 years ago, when I first started experimenting in strength training, I wasn't looking for an easier way to do things. I was looking for a better way to do them. A more efficient way, a faster way. And had it been necessary to train 60 hours a week, I would have been fully prepared to do that. But in fact, the more I have reduced my training, the better results I've gotten. And that is regardless of the tool. I still believe, I believe more and more the passage of every week, that the two most common mistakes in exercise today are A, people don't train hard enough, and B, they train too much. About 40 years ago, some man whose name now escapes me said in print, that was about the time that the marathon workouts were starting, and he said something that I read and noted and now remember and should have paid attention to then and didn't have sense enough to. He said, perhaps instead of trying to determine how much exercise we can tolerate, perhaps we should be trying to find out how little exercise we actually require. Now, I'm certainly not against exercise. But to be of value, exercise must involve overload. If it doesn't, you're wasting your time. Once you have learned to spell your name, then no amount of practice sitting at a table writing your name thousands and thousands or millions of times will improve either your spelling or your vocabulary. You can now do that. If you want to increase your ability in spelling or your vocabulary, you better practice words that are impossible, momentarily impossible. And the same thing is true physically. If you can do it, then doing it won't do you any good. It may retain your existing ability, but it will not build any new ability. Exercise without overload is worthless. It's a waste of time. Exercise with overload is difficult. It's hard. It's uncomfortable. At times it's painful. But if you're not willing to pay that price, then don't bother. You're wasting your time. Exercise is not capable of producing, note the word, producing anything of benefit. It can produce quite a few things of a negative benefit, that is to say, bad things. Exercise can produce an injury. Exercise can produce a loss in strength. That's not why you're exercising. But don't expect exercise to produce a damn thing of value. It can't. Exercise is a catalyst. It is a signal to your body that your presently existing level is inadequate to meet the demands that you are imposing upon your body. Therefore, if you're going to overload your body, you're going to send it a signal to grow, and it won't grow without that signal. If you're going to send it a signal to grow, then you must overload yourself. Now, if there were a God, and he came down on a bolt of lightning and performed 12 miracles to prove that he was God, and pointed at me and said, Arthur, 80% intensity is better than 100%. That information would be useless. Intensity of exercise can be measured at only two levels, 0 and 100%. When you are doing nothing, then your intensity is 0. Well, now we know that won't do it. But even if we knew that 80% was all that's required, or if we knew that that was better than 100%, how do we know when we're doing 80%? We don't. So the only way to know that you are involving overload is to continue an exercise to the point of momentary muscular failure, to the point that it's impossible to continue. Then you have overloaded the muscle. And then, if you give it a chance, it'll grow. In the audience here, there is, or there was, a man from the local high school, Bill Bradford. 10 years ago this summer, I had been reading over a period of a year or so before that some of the insane, ridiculous, criminal statements made by people promoting, touting isokinetic exercise devices. And I wrote an article entitled One Less Bump, pointing out some of the insanities in their claims. Among other things, these people left out the most important part of exercise, the negative work. And then they pointed at what they had left, which is nothing, as some sort of an improvement. And I pointed out in the article, One Less Bump, that this reminded me of the old joke about the first improvement in the square wheel. They went from a square wheel to a triangular wheel, and then they tried to rationalize it as being an improvement on the grounds that it provided only 3 bumps per revolution instead of 4. I went on to say that I'm reminded of a man who announces that he has revolutionized transportation without knowing what transportation means, without understanding the purpose of it. He went to a car, he examined it, and now he has built a car with no engine. And now he claims it's an improved car on the grounds that it's less expensive, that it's lighter, doesn't produce all those noxious fumes or make all that heat or vibration or noise, and doesn't require all that expensive fuel. Well, it doesn't go anywhere either, but since he didn't know it was supposed to, he hasn't noticed that. Well, when you leave the negative part out of exercise, you've left the engine out of your car. Don't bother. There's nothing left. Recently, they began to notice this. So now they're trying to change physical law to suit themselves. One of the most famous studies published and still being handed out in the medical community, or the scientific community, if you can call it that, is a study proving, quote unquote, the superiority of isokinetic exercise. Now, this study was conducted, this research was conducted, and the paper was published by Jack Wilmore, former president of the American College of Sports Medicine, and Tom Pipes. Or was it? That's the names on it. But Wilmore has since bailed out, claiming that, in fact, he had nothing to do with it. He wasn't there, didn't know about it. Which is interesting, since Pipes bailed out 2 years earlier, claiming that he wasn't there and didn't know anything about it. Did you conduct the study? I damn sure didn't. Wilmore didn't. Pipes didn't. Who the hell did? Nobody. Well, when the thing was published, I published articles ridiculing it and pointing out that 2 and 2 are not 19, no matter what somebody says. 9 years later, somebody else began to suspect that, gee, maybe there is a little fraud here. So they wrote Wilmore wanting the data, which was not forthcoming. Then they got a little pushy, and eventually some obviously hastily cobbled together figures were sent to him to hush him up. But unfortunately, he could do things like third-grade grammar school arithmetic, you know, and he examined these figures. And what did they have to do with the original study? Not a damn thing. So he blew the whistle on them. They faked it. They didn't even do the study. Still being handed out. It'll probably be handed out 20 years from now. A whole industry has been based on it. That's par for the course. I could stand here and list you 1,000 equally criminal things that are being done. The whole health food industry is one massive multi-hundred-million-dollar con game. The latest one is the Cambridge diet. You want to lose 15 pounds a week? You can. A pound of fat and 14 pounds of muscle. Our most recent figures, only 17 people have been killed by this diet so far. That's the ones we know about. And who's promoting this? Jack Feather. Who is Jack Feather? Well, check the United States court records, and you can find his name here and there for criminal fraud, the sauna belt, the sauna pants, the Mark Eden bust developer, and on and on and on. Now, his latest one, which is being marketed through doctors who don't know any better, is the Cambridge diet. And what has Cambridge University got to do with this? Not a damn thing. But Jack Feather is spending the better part of $2 million a week advertising the Cambridge diet. Now, is Cambridge University supposed to spend $4 million a week advertising the fact that they're not involved, that they were never involved, that they don't know a damn thing about it? This year, he'll probably make $100 million off the net clear profit, maybe $200 million off the Cambridge diet. He'll kill a few hundred people. He will mess up a few 100,000. And next year, it'll be something else. And since there are always fools out there desperately anxious to do something in an impossible hurry, there'll be more victims, more suckers. You can produce rapid muscle increases under the right conditions. You can produce rapid muscle losses very easily. You can produce rapid increases in fat. But you cannot produce rapid losses of fat. And anybody who tells you otherwise is either a fool or a fraud, and probably both. And if you are dumb enough to believe them, then you're a fool. And millions of people are. Now, we didn't say much about Mr. Feather when he was merely putting out the Mark Eden bust developers, which he sells for $10 and pays 32 cents for. He probably spends $8 a piece advertising them, but it doesn't matter. He still makes a big profit because the thousands of millions of little girls around the country desperately anxious to build up their bus line, so they spend $10 on a 32-cent item, and then they read the instruction booklet, and if they were to follow the instructions, they'd have to spend 22 hours a week, you know, doing this in various positions. And what kind of results will they get? None. So after a few days, they find they don't have 22 hours a week to do this, so they throw it in the back of the closet. They don't ask for a refund because they figure, well, gee, I didn't follow the instructions. Well, you know, that's fraud, but it's not hurting anybody particularly. Not that I approve of it, I don't. But he's doing something now that's dangerous. This is criminal malpractice. This is hurting people. This is going to kill a lot of people. And the medical community in general is so misinformed on the subject of nutrition, which most of them can't spell, that they get a thing through the mail. It looks like it was put out by the AMA, the American Medical Association. It's very well printed. It's very impressive. It's got a lot of gobbledygook. The doctor picks it up and looks at it and says, oh, yes, this is for people losing weight. They come in, they recommend it. They don't know any better. If you want to learn about exercise or nutrition, don't go to an MD. They simply don't know. They mean well, but they don't know. By the way, don't go to one for snake bite either. I made that mistake a time or two. I'm damn lucky to be here. There are things that doctors know, and there are things they don't know. Nutrition, exercise, there are rare exceptions in this. Someday I hope to meet one. Exercise is valuable, probably more valuable than you people who are, in general, a biased for audience. You're in favor of it, or you wouldn't be here. You're interested, or you wouldn't be here. Exercise has potential benefits that few of you even suspect. Exercise is not a desirable part of life. It is an essential part of life. It is an absolute requirement for life itself. Now, why isn't this more broadly recognized? For several reasons. For one, the time cause and effect relationship is so far in time that most people don't notice it. If I go over here and take this young lady by the throat and choke off her air, within seconds she's aware that oxygen is a requirement for life. If I lock her in a room with no water, within a few hours she will begin to suspect that water is a requirement for life. If I lock her in there long enough that she gets ravenously hungry, she will begin to suspect that food is a requirement for life. The oxygen time effect, or cause-effect time relationship is very close, a matter of seconds. Water, a matter of hours. Food, a matter of days. Exercise is just as important as any of those things, but the time factor is much greater, spread out in time. So that if you don't exercise, you don't immediately become aware of it. Might take you months or years, by which time you will have done irreversible damage to yourself, and some that perhaps isn't irreversible. I donated $3 million to the University of Florida a few weeks ago for a study that'll run at least 8 years on osteoporosis, the demineralization of bones, which affects 70% of the people in this room right now, and will eventually affect all of you to a greater or lesser degree. Primarily, it shows up in postmenopausal women. All of you have heard about the old woman who fell and broke her hip. I suppose that has happened. But generally, in thousands of cases every month, what happens is this: the hip breaks and then they fall. They're walking across the room, they're standing, and the next thing they know, they're laying on the floor. And when they try to get up, they can't. And then subsequently, they find that their hip is broken. So later they say, well, gee, I don't remember tripping, but I must have, because the next thing I knew, I was on the floor, and the fall broke my hip. Not so. The hip break came first. That's why they fell. A third of those women are dead 6 months later. None of them will ever again lead a normal life. What happened? Osteoporosis, demineralization of the bones. Why? It can be caused by a number of things: tuberculosis, syphilis, a weightless environment, certain other conditions, but primarily lack of exercise. We're doing a computer search right now back 40 years worldwide in every language of anything ever printed on the subject of osteoporosis. A few years ago, an MD did the same thing and afterwards wrote a paper, and then at the end of it he said, there are only 3 things of value to osteoporosis, and they are in the order of importance: exercise, exercise, and exercise. So we know that exercise will help prevent osteoporosis. We know that in some conditions it will help reverse it. What kind of exercise? How often? How hard? How long? We don't know. But we're going to find out. One of the problems with osteoporosis, or demineralization of the bones, is that until recently it has been impossible to diagnose it except by autopsy, and most people seem to be biased against that. I don't know why, but we are now in possession of one, the newspaper said 14, in fact there are 2 in the world, of one of 2 machines capable of doing a bone scan of the entire body and telling you precisely the mineralization of your bones. This is still an experimental machine. It's the University of Florida. It's based on nuclear medicine. We bought it and paid for it and donated it to the University of Florida. You have to get permission through the nuclear energy people to use the damn thing, to get the isotopes. With this machine, we can measure changes in bone density without exposing the people to dangerous radiation or anything of this sort, and without autopsy. The women that are part of this study are also signing over their bodies to us at the time they die so that we can autopsy them. And what we're going to do, we're going to sectionalize them. We're going to cut them up like salami and sectionalize them and look at what in fact has taken. I'm not joking. In fact, do you have any of those sectionalized pictures here? You might be interested in seeing some of the pictures we've done already working with corpses. And we couldn't get the live volunteers to, to submit to some reason. Prejudice. This study will go on for 8 years. What are we going to find out? We don't know. But it has already led to several valuable developments, one of which is sitting out there in the hall, the low back machine. That machine is a direct offshoot of that study. Because sometimes you can create a treatment for a condition that you can't use. For example, a person with advanced osteoporosis cannot stand compression forces on the spine. It is not uncommon for people to lose as much as 8 inches of height from multiple compression fractures of the vertebra. So they cannot stand longitudinal force compression. And yet they are dying for lack of exercise. So the treatment they can't tolerate. So we are now developing, or attempting to develop, and we already have with the low back machine, exercise devices that involve 0 longitudinal compression forces. So the first offshoot of that is the most important machine we've ever built, the low back machine. Important not only for osteoporosis, but for other people. But we're doing research in a number of areas, the results of which will be published, in the case of the osteoporosis, by the University of Florida School of Medicine in due course. We hope to have some preliminary data in about 6 months, and that will be updated every 6 months afterwards for at least 10 years. We're trying, if we can, to develop some sort of a relationship between muscle hypertrophy and bone density hypertrophy, because we do know that you can cause your bones to grow, not only in the density, but also in size. How? To what degree? How to do it safely? We don't know those things yet, but we're trying to find out. Among other things, we're also going to do at Mount Sinai Hospital, in cooperation with Mike Pollock, who is, I believe, still president of the American College of Sports Medicine, or last year, who formerly worked with Cooper, since left. I don't know if they're speaking or not, but in any case, we're going to do some cardiovascular testing using the squat machine. I believe you have seen a demonstration of akinetic use of the squat machine. Now, some of the people in cardiovascular testing are saying that simply raising the pulse is not enough. that you must do it with the muscles of your lower body. Well, what muscles does that machine involve? The squat machine is not only the best machine that we will ever build for the purpose of, or anybody else, for the purpose of developing strength and overall body mass, but it's also the best cardiovascular tool. And we're now going to shove that down the throat of the scientific community. You know, the Wright brothers came from a little town up in Ohio. For 3 years, they flew their airplane every day out of a pasture within the city limits. During those 3 years, there was never a mention of it in the local paper. One day, the editor is reading the paper, you know, the New York paper, and he sees a picture of the Wright brothers flying their airplane by the Eiffel Tower in front of about 6 million Frenchmen. In the meantime, for 3 years, at any time he could have sent a photographer out there to take a picture of a miracle happening within the city limits of his own hometown, but he didn't bother. So when does he print something about it? After he reads it in the New York paper, courtesy of the Paris paper, Paris, France. Well, you can sit around waiting for these people to admit the obvious if you intend to live to be 300 years old, because it'll take you that long, or you can shove it down their throat. So we're in the process of shoving it down their throat. Okay, that's all I have to say.